When doing the work becomes a license to leave. How coaching ideology infiltrates relationships and rewrites responsibility. One of the most persistent deflections I hear when I describe what happened in my marriage is this: it must have been more than coaching. Something else must have been wrong. Coaching might have been a factor, but it can't explain that level of change. That response is comforting. It keeps coaching safely contained as a tool, not a worldview. It preserves the idea that work-based learning stays at work, and relationships fail for private, personal reasons. The problem is, that explanation doesn't fit the evidence. What I saw, heard, and lived through was not a vague influence. It was a coherent ideological shift, absorbed through workplace learning and coaching, modeled by authority figures, and then applied wholesale to an intimate relationship by one person, without the other's knowledge or consent. To understand how that happens, you have to stop treating conversations like the one between Jay Headley and Joseph Scott as abstract philosophy. You have to treat them as operating systems. Because that's what they are. Well, the new needs come up. They're constantly arising. They're constantly, whatever's not being satiated in that moment. And so you've got esteem needs. You've got recognition and belonging needs. You've got survival needs. You've got power and a drive needs achievement. There's so many needs in there that if those needs aren't known and there's the understanding that your job is to satiate my needs and my job is to, if you satiate my needs, satiate your needs, and that's what gets us along. I mean, look how many couples are in their 70s who have just been married for 30, 40, 50 years, who are just like fucking strangers in bed together. Like, quite literally. Like, you're there, and to an extent, you satisfy my security needs, you satisfy my financial needs, you satisfy these needs, and then that's enough. Ideology disguised as insight. In the Headley-Scott conversation, relationships are framed through a rigid developmental hierarchy. At the bottom are needs-based relationships. According to Headley, 95 to 97% of relationships fall into this category and are unsustainable. That claim is not based on empirical research, population studies, or longitudinal relationship data. It is asserted as truth. Above that sit choice-based relationships, and beyond that, choiceless relating, where reality itself is said to run your life. Notice what's missing. There is no evidence, no falsifiability, no acknowledgement of cultural, economic, parenting, health, or life stage factors. Just a sweeping declaration that almost all human relationships are structurally deficient. That is not psychology. It is ideology. And ideology does something very specific. It sorts people into categories, then assigns moral weight to those categories. How one person ends up above the relationship. Once this framework is internalized, the person doing the work is no longer just learning. They are ascending. They are more aware, more awake, less driven by needs, more aligned with reality. Their partner, by contrast, is not simply different. They are framed as static, unconscious, attached, or developmentally behind. This is not a mutual lens. It is an asymmetrical one. In my case, that asymmetry showed up everywhere. Statements of love and commitment across months were minimized as just moments in time. Anger during the pressure years of raising children was frozen into permanent identity. You were my world, once expected and valued, was suddenly reframed as unhealthy dependency. I was told I would never change, even as circumstances that shaped our lives were about to change again. I was told I would never understand, and that I didn't need to. These are not random phrases. They are perfectly consistent with the ideology. Breakdown as virtue, shock as evidence. One of the most revealing moments in the Headley-Scott conversation is when Scott casually notes that the other partner often doesn't see it coming. That should stop the conversation cold. In any ethical relational framework, blindsiding your partner is a serious failure of care. Here, it is treated as expected. Why? Because shock is reinterpreted as proof. Proof that the other person was attached to the past. Proof they were still operating from needs. Proof they were static. In this model, Harm is not a warning sign. It is confirmation that the process is working. That is how responsibility quietly dissolves. The greenhouse metaphor and the justification of demolition. Headley's greenhouse analogy makes this explicit. The greenhouse represents childhood structures, attachments, and meaning-making. The oak tree represents the individual's potential. The solution is to dismantle the greenhouse quickly so the oak can grow. But in real human lives, those structures include marriages, shared history, emotional bonds, and relational commitments. Pulling them apart rapidly is not neutral. It is destabilizing. Yet the metaphor reframes demolition as liberation. If the greenhouse must come down, then whatever is damaged in the process is unfortunate but necessary. The focus stays on the oak, never on what is lost. This is how leaving becomes not just permissible, but righteous. Workplace coaching is not contained. Defenders often say, this was workplace learning, not personal coaching. That distinction does not hold. The same ideology is applied by the coaching room across leadership development, leadership and development, and individual coaching. Headley himself applies it openly to his own marriage. When senior figures' relationships are discussed in the workplace as developmental examples, the boundary between work and life has already been crossed. One partner is being trained inside a worldview. The other is being evaluated by it. Neither is told this is happening. That is not growth. That is asymmetry. Why there must have been more misses the point. When people insist there must have been something else, they are not wrong emotionally. They are wrong structurally. Of course there was more. There is always more in a long relationship. But the question is not whether other factors existed. The question is which explanation best fits the pattern of language, timing, certainty, and behavior. This one does. You do not need admiration for the messenger to absorb the message. You can call someone arrogant and still internalize their framework. Ideology does not require liking. It requires repetition and authority. And once absorbed, it does not present itself as one view among many. It presents itself as reality. The real cost. The most dangerous part of this ideology is not that it encourages change. People change all the time. It is that it rewards unilateral change with moral superiority, while recoding the other person's pain as developmental lag. Once that move is made, dialogue becomes unnecessary. Accountability becomes optional. The relationship becomes a structure to be outgrown. That is how one ideology can infiltrate any relationship. Not by force, not by malice, but by quietly rearranging who gets to define what growth means, and who is left behind when it happens. And once you see that, it's very hard to pretend it was just something else.